When we initially write something, it always tends to make sense in our mind because we have context that's making our writing make sense. But when somebody else reads it, or when we read it, weeks or years later, we don't have that context, or they don't have that context in the background of their mind. So they have to understand the writing as it's presented to them on the page. And sometimes I have that experience where I'm reading something, and it may be something that I wrote myself, and I have to read the sentence multiple times to understand it. And that's something that we don't want when we write. Um, One of the reasons this happens is related to time and sequence in our sentences, in particular, also in our storytelling, but in our sentences. For example, let's say we have a sentence that says, "The forest burned to ash before the mage even raised his hand, the spell already spoken beneath his breath." Okay, this sentence can be confusing, and we might have to read it twice because the effect, the forest burning to ash, is being told to us before we know what caused it. So that's what really oftentimes can hamper our understanding of where to go of something, is because we put the effect before the cause. Let me give you another example of this. Get rid of that. Say we have a sentence that says, "She saw the dragon fall from the sky, its wings shattered by the arrow she had loosed moments earlier." Okay. Sometimes these sentences don't confuse us a ton, but sometimes they do, right? But here again, we have the effect of the action happening or being written about or being communicated to us, the dragon falling from the sky and its wings being shattered, before we know what caused it, by the arrow she had loosed moments earlier, right? The natural flow of this is to have the action that's taken, that is the cause, to be structured before we have the effect, right? So we should have her loosing the arrow and then the dragon falling from the sky afterwards, and that would make more sense to our brain. But when we have the effect before we have the cause of the effect, we have this time skip, and our brain has to go back sometimes and say, "Oh wait, right, what happened first here?" And it can get even more confusing when we've got a lot of different time elements going on in our writing. Let's get rid of this one. Let me give you just another example of a sentence that can be even more confusing than these ones. Say the king had already been crowned, but bells still ringing, and the messenger finally arrived with news of the battle that had not yet ended. Okay, there's a lot going on in this sentence with time and with sequence. So we have all these time cues. We have the king had already been crowned, the bells still ringing when the messenger finally arrived with news of the battle that had not yet ended, right? So we have already something that had already happened before, right? Something that's ongoing, right? Something that just occurred, and then we have something again that's ongoing, right? There are all these time cues in here, and it makes for a very muddy sentence that's very hard to understand because sequencing gets so messed up in our brains. So does this mean you never want anything that's out of sequence? Well, that's not necessarily true. There might be times where you want to put something in your writing out of sequence intentionally. I can give you a potential example of that. Let's say a sentence like, the door was broken and hanging awry, and then they saw that it had been forced. So here we have something out of sequence. We have the effect first, the door being broken and hanging awry, and then we are told about what caused that. The door had been forced. The reason this works, though, and works well, is because we're discovering something in the same moment that the characters in the story are discovering it. So it has us in sync with them, whereas some of those other sentences were actually out of sync with the characters in the story because they were taking the action and then the consequence was happening. Let me show you just one more maybe example. So you can kind of get a feel. The shadow that passed over them, swift and black, for a dark creature was above, wheeling in the sky. Okay, similar thing. We have the thing that's causing the shadow being communicated after we have the shadow passing over them. But the characters, that's the first thing that they would notice is the shadow passing over them. And then they would see, oh, what is causing that? So again, that has us in sync with how the characters are experiencing it. And one other reason that we might want to put the effect before the cause, right, is if we really want to call attention to something. Whatever we say first in a sentence is what is going to be the focus of that sentence. It's going to be what's most prominent to the reader about that sentence. And sometimes we really want the thing to be most prominent. We want it to be something that might be out of sequence. So there could be a reason like that to choose. For example, if here what we really care about communicating to is the shadow, we really want people to understand this and pay attention to this. The shadow, swift and black, right? And that's the impression we're trying to give. Well, having that up front is very effective. Although in this case it works for two reasons, because it's the same way that the characters are experiencing it in the story. Anyway, so if you have sentences that confuse your readers or that confuse you and you have to read them multiple times when you're coming back to them, one thing to look for is there a problem with sequence, cause and effect sequence in your sentence?